Welcome, everyone. I'm Rob Gertner. I'm a faculty member at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, where I'm also the faculty director of the Rustandy Center for Social Sector Innovation. And it's great to welcome you all to the panel on the role of philanthropy and business. Our panelists today, I'm just going to give you titles, and then I'll actually ask each of the panelists to say a little bit more about who they are. So to my immediate left is Nina Vinick. She's a program director at the Joyce Foundation, where she leads the Gun Violence Prevention and Justice Reform Program. In the middle is John Edelman, who's managing director for global engagement and corporate responsibility at Edelman. And on my far left, your far right, is Richard Edelman, president and CEO of Edelman. Why don't we start, Nina, why don't you just tell us a little bit more about your background?
Sure, thank you, and good Friday afternoon to everyone, and thanks to you all for sticking it out until the last panel of the day. As Rob said, I'm Nina Vinick, and I work at the Joyce Foundation in Chicago, where I direct our gun violence prevention and justice reform program. I am a proud graduate of the law school and came to philanthropy really after a career as a plaintiff civil rights lawyer and then as an advocate for gun violence prevention and gun safety policies. I never really aspired to work in philanthropy, so it's interesting that I'm here today to talk about the role of philanthropy in gun violence prevention. But what I have found is that philanthropy is, I think, not well understood, but really important player in addressing, a tough social problem like gun violence. Maybe I'll say a couple of words about the Joyce Foundation if you're not familiar with us. The Joyce Foundation is based in Chicago. Our mission is to advance racial equity and economic mobility for the next generation of residents in the Great Lakes region. And we do that by supporting nonpartisan education, policy development, policy advocacy, and implementation across 5 issue areas. In addition to gun violence prevention and justice reform, we work on the environment, we work in areas of democracy, education and economic mobility, and arts and culture. So I think I'll stop there and go over to the Edelmans.
Okay. Yeah, I'm John Edelman. I'm managing director of global citizenship at Edelman. And Edelman is a communications company based here, started by my father 68 years ago. And my role at the company is to oversee all the community involvement and pro bono and environmental initiatives that we undertake in the communities where we operate. And on top of that, very interested in the philanthropy side and also the CSR piece because they're integrated. But I'm also president of the Daniel J. Edelman Family Foundation, and we're wanting to support communities and organizations that are involved in important issues like this.
And I'm Richard Edelman, his brother. And so most important, I run the largest PR firm in the world. And last August, after the shooting in El Paso of 25 Hispanics, I said that's enough. And we need to try to get our clients' business involved in gun control. And so we volunteered $1 million of our time to the Gun Safety Alliance. And we did a study, which I'm happy to talk about later or now, maybe later, about proving out that, in fact, business benefits from supporting gun control, not that it's bad, because that's the presumption of CEOs, and it's false. Business benefits, not just from better communities, but actually customers will buy more products from companies, and employees will work for companies more loyally if they actually support gun control. So I have the data, because that's why I'm at the University of Chicago. Without data, you make no comments, period.
So as
Harvard,
you
you
can
could just
see, we
talk.
have a great group to speak about the ways in which both the philanthropic sector and the business sector can play a role in addressing this problem. And I think the way we'll structure the conversation is we'll go back and forth, and hopefully it'll turn into a bit of an interactive discussion. But I think what we'll do first is ask each of the panelists to talk about what they do, what their organizations do with respect to the gun violence problem, and then follow up after that with why they do what they do. So why don't we start with you, Richard? You just started into it, so why don't you go into a little bit more detail now?
Okay, so we decided to confront the perception that it's bad for business to get involved with guns. You know, meaning that if you do what Levi Strauss does or whatever, or Dick's, you're going to have a boycott and you're going to lose your customers. And everybody pointed to the decline of sales in Dick's when they took firearms out of the stores. So what we actually found, and we did this study last August and September, is that 75% of consumers said, I will buy more products from businesses which support gun control. Now, let's define gun control. That means safe storage, means with no ammunition in there, locked up like that, and background checks. What people don't want is for guns not to be available. They don't want to get rid of the Second Amendment. You know, so they're happy to support. Now, importantly, this is 3-to-1 true of Democrats and 2-to-1 true of Republicans. It's true of both males and females. It's true of people with 18-year-olds. It's also true of people 60-year-old. So it's cross. And so now, in addition, for employees, 75% of those who work in business said, I am more likely to stay with a company if it endorses gun control. In a 3% unemployment economy, this is big. This is really important. This actually is sort of like a sustainability. You know, I'm pro-environment, I'm pro-gun control. Okay, now, so we are organizing salon dinners. Nina came to one, trying to attract CEOs to discuss gun control. So Chicago is a problem, meaning we have, I think, 200 companies that have signed on to a letter by an alliance of gun safety folks, Brady, et cetera, and the coasts are where the signatories are. Chicago has 2. I'm one of them out of 200. And so that's no good. And so at that dinner, Nina very passionately said, come on, this is important. You have to show your employees that this matters, and come on, sign on. So we invited United, and we invited, you know, all the big Chicago companies, and frankly, the only ones who came were the financial services ones. I found that fascinating. The sort of citadels and, you know, banks and things like this, and that was great. That was great as far as it went. The rest, we're not making progress. So we're doing this in 9 other cities in a very, you know, way of just going to the CEOs directly and saying, this is the data, you need to be part of this. This is critical. And some of them are afraid of Trump. Some of them are afraid of politics. Some of them are just afraid. And I don't know how better to say it. But we keep putting the data in front of them, and we keep telling them that's what their employees and their customers want. So that's the story. We're halfway across the river, and we're going to keep rowing. Over to you.
Okay, so why this is important, sort of stepping ahead, because it's relevant to Chicago, but also in terms of the corporate responsibility, it aligns to our values. Our 4th value is commitment to positively impact society. So what better way than to actually make a difference? The second part of that is, as was talked about, I'm sure, throughout the day, you know, gun safety, gun violence, it's a public health issue. So another part of our key commitment is to align our pro bono efforts to the Sustainable Development Goals. And the 3rd Sustainable Development Goal is healthy lives, ensuring healthy lives and well-being. So that's clearly a key reflection, because we also, as part of our citizenship effort, we do a report every year. We do a survey of our employees. We ask our employees, what are the 5 sustainable development goals you want Edelman to get engaged with? Well, health and safety was one of them. So it's a clear, aligning the vision and the values to the actual implementation, as my brother shared, what we're doing pro bono in gun safety is a direct connection into the CSR space. So with that filter that we talk about sustainable development goals, we also have another commitment that 50% of our hours will be dedicated to pro bono against the sustainable development goals. So there you see an integrated approach that try day to day. This is our overarching picture globally, and this is what we all around the world, we want our offices to align against these 5 sustainable development goals. So in the case of Chicago and what we're doing with the Gun Safety Alliance, it's a clear intersection of the values, the goals, and how we are implementing across the world.
So just to add to John, it's important to note that of the 200, almost half, a little bit more than half, were tech companies. And a lot of them were the smaller sort of tech companies, not Apple, et cetera, but, I don't know, like Kevin Ryan, who's a tech guy in New York, has a tech company, Mongo signed on, $500 million in revenue, market cap, probably 8 times revenue, but that's who's signing on, and financial services or like entrepreneurs, not big companies.
How about the work of the Joyce Foundation?
So the Joyce Foundation, I think, is maybe a little bit different than some of the other folks that you've heard from over the course of the day, or even who are here in the room, in the sense that the foundation started working on gun violence prevention in the early 90s. In 1992, the Gun Violence Prevention Program was founded. And that was a time when very, very few other foundations were working on the issue of gun safety and gun policy reform. Our work in criminal justice reform is much newer. That was an area that our board added to our program just a couple of years ago, really to focus on the intersections between reforms needed in the criminal justice system and the justice system's response to gun violence. But our focus on gun violence has really, I think, made the Joyce Foundation the longest continuous national funder of gun violence prevention and gun policy reform. And I think that's important because, this is an issue that you have to think about as a marathon and not a sprint. To use a bad gun analogy, there's no magic bullet that's going to solve this problem. And I think one thing that philanthropy can do to address a tough social challenge like this is we can afford to experiment and take risks and fill gaps in public sector responses because we're not, beholden to taxpayers or to shareholders, other than to, our board of directors. And one way that we've tried to do that is by filling the gap in public funding for research to develop solutions to gun violence. And maybe I can talk about some of the ways we've done that a little bit later. The other way that we've tried to do that is really to take an integrated approach to this issue, focusing on solutions at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level. And so I think a lot of the speakers that we've heard from over the course of the day have perspectives and lanes that focus on one or another of those sets of solutions. We heard from the last panel about local solutions here in Chicago to address gun violence. We've heard about efforts at the federal level to enact stronger gun laws in the Congress. And then we've heard about efforts at the state level really to step in the failure of Congress to act. And in truth, none of those by themselves is going to be sufficient. And we really need to be firing on all cylinders to address this problem, given the scope of the problem. And, that's something that the Joyce Foundation has done since the inception of the program. We've really tried to support efforts at all of those levels, local, state, and federal, as well as research, and for that matter, work in the courts, where we started our day today.
So maybe you could go into a little more detail on some. First of all, can you explain the reason for the research gap? Is there anything interesting going on? And then why don't you talk a little bit more about the research work that you support?
Sure. So we heard earlier today about the mismatch in federal support for studying gun violence and the prevention of gun violence compared to other medical and public health challenges. Part of the reason for that, as we heard, is something called the Dickey Amendment, which for 25 plus years prohibited the CDC from using federal funds to promote or advocate for gun control. And as a practical matter, that created a near total chilling effect on the CDC and to an extent other federal agencies in supporting research on the prevention of gun violence. That has now changed with a recent appropriation just last year of $25 million to the CDC and NIH, first time in more than 2 decades for those agencies to study gun violence, which is a really welcome development. In that period of time when federal funding was severely curtailed, the Joyce Foundation has been funding researchers to study gun violence and solutions to gun violence. And we actually recently took a look back at our support for research over the past 25 years. And, we are, we're a mid-sized foundation. We have about $1 billion in assets. We give away about $50 million a year across all of our programs. And over the last 25 years, we've granted about $32 million in total to support research on gun violence prevention. So, those resources are never going to match the federal government. But it was a time when, without public funding, the foundation felt very strongly that we had an obligation to support researchers to study this public health problem. And over that period of time, with that relatively modest investment, more than 200 papers, academic papers, were produced identifying risk factors and protective factors for gun violence, evaluating policy solutions to gun violence, developing the data infrastructure to study gun violence. And, in many ways, those grants really kept the field alive during that period of time. And we're incredibly proud of that work. Let me give you maybe a couple of specific examples of some of those efforts that we funded. The first is an effort to improve the data infrastructure to study gun violence, and that was through a pilot initiative back in the late 90s and early 2000s that was run out of Harvard University to collect data at the state level on all violent deaths, to develop a complete picture of the circumstances surrounding those deaths. So if it was a gun death, what kind of gun was used, who had access to that gun, how was that gun stored, what time of day did the incident take place, and so on. And it turns out that data is not collected by only one entity. It's collected, different kinds of data on each violent death are collected by multiple entities, law enforcement agencies, coroners, medical examiners, public health departments, and so on. And so this was a pilot that was set up to see if those different data sources could be integrated to create a more complete picture of all violent deaths at the state level. The Joyce Foundation and a number of other funders supported the pilot, which created the system before it moved over to the CDC in 2002 and became what is now known as the National Violent Death Reporting System. Started in 6 states in 2002 after the pilot sort of established proof of concept with private philanthropic support, and then became federally funded. But the federal funding was slow, and it was gradual. And so the program went from 6 states to 13 states to 18 states to 32 states. And during that time, the foundation supported education and advocacy to make the case for why this was an important data set and why it could be useful in informing policymaking and prevention and research around the prevention of violence. Just last year, the program finally was fully funded at the CDC to expand to all 50 states. So I think this is a good example of how a small group of funders can come together, develop an idea, really, for something that can really change the way we collect and think about and use data to inform a challenge like gun violence. So we're incredibly proud of those investments. I'll mention one other. You heard a lot this morning about background checks for gun purchases and the advocacy effort to expand background checks to private transfers, whether they're over the internet or at gun shows or just between private individuals. And that's a policy that the Joyce Foundation's research helped develop over the years. Well, because of the success of those advocacy efforts, a number of states have enacted comprehensive background check laws over the past half dozen years or so, and that's created a bit of a natural experiment where we can study the impact of those laws at the state level and understand what's working and what maybe is not working as well and how those can be improved. So the Joyce Foundation funded research in a number of states that have new background check laws, some that have had them for a number of years. And we learned that background checks can be effective at reducing homicides and suicides by gun, but they are most effective when they are implemented as part of a licensing or permitting system for gun owners at the state level. So background checks by themselves maybe are not as effective as they could be, but when used as part of a license system, they can have a significant impact. And again, that's based on a series of studies that the foundation funded really to evaluate these policies that the advocates have been working on and understand how they can most effectively be implemented.
Yeah, Richard, go ahead.
So it's one thing for companies to be involved in gun control. It's another to try and change the ecosystem. And I think more promising is the latter for business. So there are 4 areas that we're trying to push business, particularly in Chicago. So the first is Mayor Lightfoot has a specific initiative for the South and the West Side. And so it involves trying to hire opportunity youth. This was done 3 or 4 years ago, started with Starbucks, 20 other companies. 100,000 youth were hired, given summer jobs, then hopefully transferred into more things. So the first is investment in human capital. The second, and related to that, is companies in Chicago have tied up with community colleges. So McDonald's has a community college relationship to prepare people for food service. So that's second area. Third area is to get employees involved in NGO boards that are small. And that relates to my fourth point. But to get employees out of the core in downtown and out into the real world and try and help by getting on boards. And then fourth, there's philanthropy that companies can do from their own foundations. Get in Chicago was a $50 million initiative from Chicago area companies to fund local NGOs. It's been modestly successful. And the key problem, interestingly, is inability to have enough scale. A lot of the NGOs could take 50 kids, 100 kids after school. They need to be able to take 1,000 kids after school. So getting from here to there is something that business theoretically could help with, the scaling of the nonprofit sector.
Can I, just a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
I'm just curious as to how and why Edelman decided to make gun violence an issue that's a priority for you. I mean,
Well, so we could have picked a lot of different ones. We happen to be co-headquartered here, and there's 700 homicides in 1 year. I mean, that's straightforward. My chief of staff's husband was accosted and with a gun. It has a certain shocking effect. I'm married to a Latina, and the El Paso thing was brought home to me in a very real way. And so I just said, that's enough. And I think, of all things, this is a place where corporations just turn their back. And that's not very okay. And we can make a difference, more than anything, just to be a pain in their rear.
On top of that, it's a great way to involve your
Staff.
Employees. Especially, I was fortunate enough to get a briefing from the Brady Group recently, and maybe Chris shared this morning, the growth of gun violence among LGBT, young girls 10 to 14, African-American men, women veterans. They're all employee resource groups at companies. And they work, and we're trying to work collectively to bring our employee resource groups together to work on community issues that link everybody together. It's great to have, it's important to have the support, but you also have to connect. So that's another great way to engage employees, and it aligns, as I said earlier, to our values and our goals, but to leverage the skills for good. And if you're able to measure impact with better gun safety, maybe gun violence will go down. And if communication skills are leveraged against that, that's a great way to show the power of communications to make an impact, both in terms of integrating employee resource groups, but also leveraging the skills for good, which is what CSR is all about and how it's integrated into the corporate strategy.
So John, as an example, one of the things that won an award at the Cannes Advertising Festival 2 years ago was Gray Advertising set up a fake store in Manhattan. And so a person came in to buy a gun. And so to go through the process, the person picks the gun, and because all the guns there had been used in violent crime. And so the guy gets to the counter and says, I'm buying this gun, does the credit card, and then somebody says, just want you to know this gun's really well experienced. It was used to shoot somebody in Chicago. And just wanted you to know. Person appalled, but it got incredible kind of social buzz. But so that's the genius of hopefully what we're able to bring to the party.
So, when I think about the role, I made a list of the ways in which I thought business could influence this problem. One is things like DICS, just direct business decisions that affect gun violence. Another, which we haven't talked about, is business as a source of technological innovation related to gun violence and gun safety. So things like gun detection technologies using AI, gun safety, smart guns, and the like. We think about business as investors in the community in which they operate, and the last one is as influencers, both of sort of norms of society and affecting policy. And I have leaders of the largest PR firm in the world here, so it seems like beyond sort of these direct programs, how do you think about the role of business in affecting sort of society's views with respect to gun violence and gun policy, and sort of, whether or not sort of that battle has not been won so much by and what role companies can play.
So I would hope that sustainability is a good model for what we could hope for. Because even if the United States has backed out of the Paris Accords, you have companies like Unilever saying we're going to cut virgin plastic use by 50%. Starbucks takes the straws out of all their coffee cups. And I could keep going ad nauseum about what companies are doing in sustainability. You don't hear the same about guns. And I think it's more likely that business will get involved in investing in jobs than directly in gun control. I would aspire to it, but some retailers, Starbucks says, please don't bring your guns into the store. They don't mandate it, but they ask you not to. Walmart's banned ammunition for ARs. So they have 2 tragedies, they had to do something. They've also taken AR sales out, guns. But that's just the retailers. It's not the broader consumer products. And Levi's has benefited in terms of sales, but it's fascinating that that is actually a consumer marketing benefit. Their sales have gone up with their core constituency. Meanwhile, Wrangler is doing much better in the red states. So Levi's has become a blue state brand. And so brand marketing people go, I want to sell in both. And maybe that's a particularly acute example because it's blue jeans and it's sort of, stylish. But anyway.
Yeah, I think it's important just to add that, there are lots of different ways for businesses to get involved in gun violence prevention. And, certainly advocating for stronger gun laws is one important way. And we are seeing more and more companies step out and, raise their voices on that issue. But, that's not going to work for every business and every corporation. But, I think we are seeing in Chicago really an unprecedented effort to bring resources together from the philanthropic sector, from the business community, and other partners to mount a comprehensive approach to address gun violence in the city. And this is an effort which I want to make sure to mention, which is called the Partnership for Safe and Peaceful Communities, which is an initiative that was launched by a core group of foundations in 2016 to respond to the dual crises that the city was facing when gun homicides and shootings spiked in 2016, but also that was coupled with a real breakdown in trust between communities and the police. And really, if you think about it, those issues are really 2 sides of the same coin. If the community and the police don't trust one another and aren't able to work together to address gun violence, then it's going to be very difficult to address the underlying violence problem. So these foundations came together with our partners in the crime lab and the mayor's office to really step in the absence of a significant investment in public sector resources to address the problem in a comprehensive way. And the Partnership for Safe and Peaceful Communities looked at the best available evidence, looked at models from other cities around the country to see what we could learn from their experience, and developed a multi-pronged approach to address gun violence and to improve police legitimacy and accountability and trust across a set of initiatives. You heard from Kim Smith earlier from the Crime Lab about the READY initiative, which is run out of the Heartland Alliance, which delivers transitional jobs, cognitive behavioral therapy, and other social supports to the young men who are at highest risk of being involved with gun violence. The other components of the Partnership for Safe and Peaceful Communities include a street outreach initiative called CP4P, or Communities Partnering for Peace, which is led by Metropolitan Family Services. And this is an initiative that invests in violence interrupters, violence intervention, street outreach workers in the neighborhoods that are struggling with high rates of gun violence to try to intervene and reduce retaliatory shootings in those neighborhoods. PSPC, Partnership for Safe and Peaceful Communities, also works to strengthen gun laws in the state, to reduce the flow of crime guns into Chicago, and it invests in programs to improve police-community relations. Finally, it invests in grassroots, neighborhood-based violence prevention programs that are really operating, these are small organizations operating at the neighborhood level to build social cohesion and crowd out the violence. And together, this is a comprehensive approach that really, frankly, was just absent in the city. It's not cheap, and that may well be one reason why it was absent in the city. Since 2016, now more than 50 donors, including private foundations, family foundations, corporations, have committed more than $75 million to support this set of initiatives. And the biggest parts of this program are all being rigorously evaluated by academic partners. The early evidence is very promising. Homicides and shootings are down in Chicago since 2016. So, we are by no means declaring victory, but I think this is just a really wonderful example of how philanthropy and the business community can come together in partnership with universities and community-based partners, as well as public sector partners, really to do something that frankly has just been unprecedented in the city.
I'll add two quick ideas that all businesses can do. One relates to your own training at your locations. Like we did a active shooter training at Edelman about several weeks ago. And one of the missing pieces was a piece about gun safety. If safe storage is key to eliminating several of the unintentional shootings that may happen, that would be an easy thing to do. You have an active shooting, training, also talk about gun safety. The second one sort of is an extension of what I talked about, health and well-being. A lot of companies are focused on health and well-being. In the sustainability space, they're even thinking about a culture of health framework about indicators and what you report against. So within that context, you should include gun safety as part of your culture of health training. So those are two immediate steps that any business can do. If you are focused on mental health and well-being in your company, add mental well-being and gun safety as part of that mix. So those are two immediate ideas that all businesses can do, because they're probably undertaking some of these initiatives already, and adding these important pieces would help a lot to sort of raise awareness and educate everybody else about all the issues that are out there.
I want to ask Nina one final question, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So first, I want to underscore something that I think was implicit in some of the things you said. First of all, the philanthropic sector is really small compared to the public sector. I couldn't quite do this calculation for gun safety and gun violence, but I've done it for education. So if you look at the largest philanthropic supporter of K through 12 education in the United States, it's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the ratio of the amount of money they give to public spending on K through 12 education is 1 to 1,000, right? So philanthropy is relatively small, and therefore sort of the way in which philanthropy actually changes society has to use the business school term, has to leverage its resources. And there are two things that I think are real challenges that showed up as successes in your discussion. One is that often philanthropy views itself as sort of doing the risky initial things and then passing it on to government, which often doesn't happen. And secondly, we always think that, the philanthropic sector, in addition to being kind of small, is also relatively fragmented. And it always seems like there are opportunities to bring the sector together. And you gave an example of each of those working. So the question is, are there any insights, broader insights on how you help make both of those things work?
Well, without sort of patting the Joyce Foundation on the back too much, I think the fact that we have stuck with this issue for so long really makes us a kind of recognized source of expertise with our peers in philanthropy. And, I think that's just given us a platform to build those partnerships, to bring other folks to the table, and the reality is, you're right. Philanthropy is fragmented, and it is said that if you know one foundation, you know one foundation. We're all very different. We have different priorities, different risk tolerance, and that's okay. But we have felt that because we have amassed this expertise on this issue, we are able to leverage that to form partnerships that we might not otherwise see. And so I said when I started that back when the foundation first got into this issue in the early 90s, I used to say that I could meet with my affinity group in a phone booth back in the days when there were phone booths. The field has definitely grown, not just among funders and philanthropy, but, the advocacy community, has grown tremendously, and that's all to the good. One other thing we've done is launch a sort of national counterpart to the Partnership for Safe and Peaceful Communities called the Fund for a Safer Future, which is an effort to bring other national funders into this issue by creating a vehicle for them to, learn from their peers and, contribute to a pooled fund, to leverage their investments on the issue. And that has grown over time now to more than 30 participating funders, and we count about $80 million that we have leveraged in direct and aligned investments. So, there's strength in numbers on this issue. And, that's true in philanthropy, it's true in business, it's true when we're talking about, grassroots pressure, it's true in the courts with judges, considering Second Amendment cases. And so I would say that's maybe a theme that I would take away from the course of today.
Okay, let's open it up for some questions. Someone's been waiting anxiously to ask a question.
We've been talking about mental health and the red flag laws and other issues regarding guns. But instead of fighting the NRA or studying youth violence, have you thought about the fact that the youth across Chicago, and I work on these issues, don't have enough athletic facilities to participate in sports in their own community? We have 77 communities We have about 80 CPS high schools, and we only have about 25 tracks, 400-meter tracks for those students to do physical education and run track for the high school team. If you, Ms. Vinick, if you were to put $4 to $5 million into one 400-meter track, you would make that school students a lot healthier. They wouldn't be going to Strozier because of diabetes, heart disease, child and adult obesity. You would hopefully create more companies and more foundations, because I've had contact with the MacArthur Foundation and with the Chicago Community Trust. The lack of athletic facilities across Chicago is a major component of why I grew up in this neighborhood with the Blackstone Rangers and the Disciples, go back to the 60s. Every suburban high school has its own stadium with its own 400-meter track. Of those 80 Chicago high schools, there are 8. So here's so I think the big major foundations here should take a look at funding infrastructure, sports infrastructure, to cut crime.
Great, thank you.
And that's something to seriously look at.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Maureen. I'm a social worker, and I wanted to know, in terms of just the thought process behind, some companies have pulled out and say they don't want to come to Chicago because they're fearful, or their employees are fearful of the crime. What has been done, or have you put any thought into how we could actually work together to let employees know, that even though they're working for a Fortune 500 company, the South Side and the West Side, there should be more collaboration, that they're not divided, and that maybe the fact that people do live on the South and West Sides, crime is pervasive there, but nobody's free from it. But if the companies could see the buy-in of us working together, I think that would be a way for us really to be able to see how to get companies to buy in, and even for them to be able to see the human capital aspect.
Okay, so you're asking two separate questions. The first is, how do you make Chicago more attractive as a corporate center?
Yes.
And the answer to that is partly image. True. So P33 is an initiative to try and get companies to recognize Chicago's prowess as a tech center.
Okay.
But it's not working quite well yet. So Honeywell just relocated from Connecticut. They didn't even think of Chicago.
Yes.
And it's partly because of violence. You are right. But the second thing is, and I know the mayor is considering this as a branding program for Chicago beyond P33, which is we're not South Side or North Side or West Side. We're all sides now. And that's your bigger point. And I agree with you. We're helping on that. Mm-hmm.
First of all, thank you for hanging in on a Friday afternoon. I, like you, probably have more faith in the private sector in addressing these kinds of issues than government. We don't need to elaborate on that. And so, like you, I'm disappointed to hear that large corporates have not really gotten behind this. And I wonder if in part, it's because gun violence, as we've heard over and over, has many, many different categories. And it may be possible, here's the question, would you think about going to the signatories of the Business Roundtable statement and saying, it may be too much to ask you to sign on to gun violence overall, but why don't we take a non-controversial apple pie and motherhood subject like veterans' suicides, and why don't you try to get behind that rather than the overall thing, and kind of nudge them into the category with the hope that it'll be a slippery slope and they'll do things better.
So our theory was that the Gun Safety Alliance would endorse background checks and safe storage. So in fact, your exact strategy. And again, we got the coasts, and so mostly tech and financial services. I think that's a really good idea, and we'll go to the Gun Safety Alliance with the idea of focusing on veterans, because many companies are plussed up on getting veterans into the workforce, and the mental aspect of it is core. So good idea, check, agree.
Well, I'll sort of, there is a high veteran suicide rate, because I'm a veteran advocate, and part of we want to make sure that we're talking clearly, because there's veteran suicides, but there's also deaths from opioids as well. So in the combination of things, we want to fight suicide everywhere. So you don't say one or the other. Ending 60 suicides a day must happen, however it happens. And so, I mean, I agree that we need to focus on the suicide, but it's suicide of everybody and not just the veterans, because that's sort of, the veterans, that's some of the misperception that we're fighting on this other front about that they have these tendencies, and that's not the case. We did research that showed that, you know, everybody has experienced a mental health trauma, whatever, but the point is, a lot of people are at risk of suicide, and it's not right to just single out one over the other. There are, but it is important to focus on suicide big picture as well.
So I've been a faculty member for a long time, and when I see a dean lurking on the side, I know there's time for only one more question. So.
Thank you for being here. So my question, as Nina kind of already hit on, is like, what is the responsibility of philanthropists to continuously build relationships with their grantees to make sure that even after their funding has subsided from that specific, so that they continuously have sustainable organization? Because we know that the critique that a lot of times philanthropy gets is that once their funding's cut off, that movement for their organization is essentially died.
It's a really good point. You know, we, again, every foundation is different. I can tell you that, you know, we work very hard at building and maintaining relationships with our grantees. And it almost never happens that a grantee will be cut off cold turkey. We virtually always, when we do have to phase out, you know, grantee for one reason or another, have a plan where, you know, they know what's coming, you know, well in advance, and, you know, we'll step down the funding over, you know, a period of time so that they can adjust, you know, to that new landscape.
Well, thank you all for staying through the whole day, and please join me in thanking the panelists for a fascinating conversation.
Thank you. Let me just add a few words. Let me thank Rob, Nina, John, and Richard for a terrific panel, and I want to thank all of our panelists throughout the day. We've heard a tremendous range of perspectives and methodologies, from law to medicine to social science and policy analysis to the perspectives of philanthropy in the business community. And I come away thinking, you know, how helpful this has been and how informative it has been. You know, at the University of Chicago, one of the taglines we often use to describe ourselves is inquiry and impact. And I think today's symposium really demonstrate that. We've seen an incredible range of inquiry across a wide variety of different disciplines, all tackling this most important social problem. And I think we also have seen the incredible impact of that scholarship and of that thinking. And I think coming out of this conference, we'll see more impact both in the collaborations from research that emerge from this, and in the collaborations that emerge from practitioners to researchers to policy makers to the business community and philanthropists. So I thank all of you. I thank everyone who came today and participated. I encourage you to join us out in the concourse for some refreshment and continued conversation. Thank you again.